Today I want to talk a little bit about listening. Now, I fully acknowledge that I'm part of the problem in this and that we only talk about listening in one unit and it's at the very end of the semester. But I really think that it's an important subject to talk about, and I actually think we really kind of do a disservice by talking about listening as little as we do, especially in communication courses, because communication isn't just about talking. That's often what we teach, that's often what we discuss is the ideas of what we're putting out there. But what is so much more important in a lot of ways is listening to others, is what you take in. Because when you think about communicating, and you're talking versus you're listening, or what you're putting out versus what you're bringing in, you might think of it as a 50-50 thing, which means at least half of what you're, communicating is on the receiving end. But it's way more than that. It's much more slanted, or the world is much more slanted towards listening. Because think about how much of your life, how much of your time you spend receiving communication without really putting a whole lot out. Now, of course, we went over that whole idea of communication being inevitable. Even if you're not saying something, you obviously are communicating. But even if it's something like right now, wherever you are as you're listening, you can't communicate back to me other than just telling me that you listen to this, responding to the, discussion questions, by my actually getting, a notification about who's listened to it and who hasn't. But you are still receiving that communication. Think about how much of your life you go through listening to others. Think about all those times that you maybe spent an entire day listening to the radio, watching TV, but not talking to anybody. This is something I'm finding, especially during this quarantine, is I'm spending so much more of my day listening to others than actually communicating. Listening is one of those skills that people tend to think they're good at when most of us are not. Most of us are really bad listeners. And there's a number of different reasons why, which we're going to talk about. But the most important thing we're going to go over are what are some of the steps we can do, what are some of the things we can do to try to make us better listeners. And the very first thing is to simply establish the difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is a physical thing, listening is a mental thing. Hearing is simply the act of your, eardrums vibrating and sending a signal to your brain that sound is happening. But listening is when you're able to mentally understand those sounds that you're hearing. This is really the difference between sitting in a class and hearing words that are being said and listening to the actual content. I'm sure this is happening to you a lot, especially with all of these online classes. You're hearing words, but you're not really mentally taking them in. You're not really mentally absorbing what's being said. So that's the first part, is just understanding that simply hearing something does not equate to listening. There's a couple of different steps that we can go through to try to make ourselves more effective listeners. We are going to go through these individually, but we have being mindful or mindfulness, becoming an active listener, understanding, responding properly, and then finally remembering what was said. And there's a little bit of debate about this last one about remembering, which we'll get to. But we're going to start with the first one of mindfulness. Now, mindfulness is one of those terms that we've been hearing quite a bit about in the world around us over the last 10 years or so. If anybody practices yoga or follows any sort of meditation, practice or routine, mindfulness is a really big part of it. And the basic way that we will often see mindfulness described in pop culture or in just general society is that it's being aware of your surroundings. It's being here in the moment. It's being part of where you are. And that is very closely related to the actual definition that we have of mindfulness within communication. That it's being aware of your surroundings. It's being aware of others. It's opening yourself up to the communication of others. Being open, being alert, being mindful that other people exist and that they have a story that's just as important as yours. And this, of course, is going to help your communication in a couple of different ways. First off, it helps you understand. It helps you be more empathetic. You don't necessarily have to understand a person's story to be empathetic towards it. You don't necessarily have to relate to a person to feel for them. Especially if somebody had a tragedy in your life or in their life, you don't have to necessarily know what they're feeling to feel for them. That is part of your mindfulness. And the more mindful you are to others, the more it promotes communication from them. Something as simple as somebody asking you how your day is and actually meaning it goes a long way. But that's the big part of this idea of mindfulness, is that actually meaning it. So there's a lot of different ways that we can talk about mindfulness. Just one example to give you is that I'm a documentary filmmaker, and one of the things that astonishes me over and over and over again, like this is a lesson I find that I have to learn every single time, is that whenever I ask people questions in documentaries, I'm blown away by the answers that people are willing to give, simply because I was willing to ask that question. Sometimes all people need is for somebody to ask, for somebody to care about what they're saying, for them to feel like they can open up. Have you ever had a person in your life where you just feel like you can talk to them? Like you feel like they care about what you're saying, and it's liberating. It makes you want to communicate with them. It makes you want to share your thoughts and your feelings because you feel like that person really cares about you. This is even how basically therapy works. Is so often a therapist isn't really going to necessarily tell you anything. They're just there to listen in a lot of cases, to listen and to understand and to make you feel heard. That is the basic idea of mindfulness. Another example of this idea of mindfulness is if anybody is familiar with the Facebook page Humans of New York. Humans of New York, I think, is a really incredible project. It basically was this by this photographer named Brandon, who went out to New York City and he was just photographing the people around him and then would ask them questions about themselves, questions about their day, about what was going on, just something they wanted to talk about. And he's gotten really good at asking questions and getting really incredible answers. Now, not every, person who talks with him gives them their life story. Some of them are just little tiny tidbits, little tiny things. Some of them are really trivial. Some are really casual. But if you follow that page, again, it's Humans of New York, it is absolutely astonishing how often people will give entire life stories. They'll talk about things that are really deep to them, that are very meaningful to them because somebody bothered to ask. These are just two stories that I thought were interesting that I found back to back. They were only posted like a day apart. So the first one, you of course can read it. He just seemed so nice and normal when we were young. He had a high-profile job. We were super spoiled. He always hugged me, always told me he loved me, always taught me things and encouraged me. But I guess the whole time he had a drug problem. He started yelling at my mom when I was 5 or 6. It would happen all the time. Then when I was 8 years old, I walked in on him beating her for the first time. She was all bruised up and crying. He looked like he wanted to kill her. We left a few years later. My mom woke us up in the middle of the night, packed our bags, and took us outside. I remember she flagged down a random car. My father ran after us in the street, begging me to stay. Just me. We got a restraining order the next day. After that, I barely spoke to him anymore. I hated him for what he did to my mom. But a few months ago, he had a bad stroke, and now he's living in a rehab center in the ghetto part of Toronto. He just sits around all day. He wears raggedy clothes. He doesn't remember anything. Whenever I visit him, he says he wishes we could go back to when we were kids. He asked me why my mom left him. Then he asks again and again. He just seems so heartbroken. It's all very pathetic. I feel bad for him. It's hard to stay mad at somebody who's not really there. That's really amazing because it's somebody who clearly had a story to tell. They were just waiting for somebody to ask. Or here's another one that's a little more lighthearted, but I really, really like the message in this one. Honestly, I just fell into it. I started as an engineering major, then one night I was slaving over my physics homework while my roommate sipped tea on the couch and read a novel. So I decided to be an English major like her. 10 years later, I'm working as a copywriter at an advertising agency. You know the feeling when you're pulling into the driveway, but you can't remember anything about your ride home? That's a bit how it feels. Like I blinked and I'm 8 years down a career path that I just sort of fell into. There's plenty to be grateful for. It's a good enough job. I'm not living paycheck to paycheck. I can afford to have fun and take vacations. But my job is not my passion. And every story you see elevated on social media is, I loved this thing, it became my passion, and then it became my career. There's not many people saying my job isn't my passion, but I love mountain biking on the weekends, and that's enough for me. I think the feeling I'm trying to resolve is a sense of enoughness. There's so much that I love about my life, but I spend most of my time at work. Is it okay to get joy outside of work, or does my passion need to be tied to my livelihood and a sense of responsibility? I really love this one because I think she's touching on something that a lot of people feel, that especially with social media, you get this sense that you're supposed to be living your quote-unquote best life all of the time, and you're supposed to be passionate about every element of your life, and that's just not the reality for most people. And I think this also relates to mindfulness, not just in the sense that she's willing to discuss something when asked about it, but also because now that she's brought it up, don't you feel like you can relate to it? That's one of the other big parts of mindfulness, is opening yourself up to each other, making that connection. It makes you more empathetic, and it absolutely makes you a better listener, and I would argue that it makes you a better person in the long run as well. The next part is trying to be an active listener, which is basically the idea between crossing over from being hearing, from being a passive listener, to mentally engaging with what that person is telling you, because being mindful is only part of it. The other part is actually listening, truly paying attention to what that person is telling you. That's actually a skill that you have to practice and learn when you become a documentary filmmaker, is that asking the questions is only part of it. Being able to listen and engage and come up with follow-up questions and really make that person want to continue talking to you because you are so engrossed in what they're saying, or at least making it appear that you're engrossed in what they're saying, is a really big part of it as well. So it is that idea of stay focused. Some of the tips that we can give to help you stay focused on another person is listen far more than you speak. Listen 75% of the time, speak 25% of the time. And even that, I think, is a little bit leaning more towards the speaking part. If you really want to listen to somebody, you really only speak to reaffirm what they're saying. Don't cut them off. Don't change the subject. Do not make it about you. That is called monopolizing, that we're going to get to. Let them finish their point. Don't finish their point for them. Relate to them, yes. Add your stories if you feel like it can create a bond between you, absolutely. But don't make it about you. You have to keep it about them. Understanding is another big part. Now, we're not going to talk a whole lot about understanding because this is basically the ideas of perception. Again, it's all of those different things that alter why you would perceive or understand something the way that you do. But one thing that we can add to it, or two things that we can add to it, is that one of the ways that you can help your understanding is to relate to them through information that you already know. Let's say that you're talking to a friend who's had a tragedy in their life and you just can't relate to it, but you might be able to relate to elements of it. So being able to relate to at least parts of it helps you somewhat see where they're coming from, and it helps you understand a little bit more why they see things the way that they do. Another one that is very easy to do on paper but incredibly difficult to do in actuality is to try to see things from the other person's perspective. People have a reason for feeling the way that they feel. Let's go back to self-concept for a second. There's a reason people are the way they are. Your thoughts, your opinions, your viewpoints are simply a culmination of your experiences. And if you have different experiences from another person, you're going to have different opinions than them. But recognizing that the reason your opinions are different is because of your different experiences can really go a long way in helping with our understanding. Try to understand those experiences. Try to understand their history. Try to understand their perspective. And it helps you get a much better sense of why people feel the way they do. And that, of course, is going to make you a much better listener. Responding is the idea that you need to show that person that you're listening. That is a big part of being an active listener as well, is you constantly keep them engaged. Now, you can do this from anything from giving verbal cues, verbal responses, throwing in ahas, paraphrasing things back to them. You know, if you ever been telling a story to somebody and they didn't laugh at the point that you thought was funny, and you're like, well, clearly you weren't listening, you want to make sure that you do this. You want to make sure that you know that that person is listening to you. We even do this through social media communication. We even do this through things like texting. Have you ever been texting somebody and then they change the subject to something completely else, and you're like, okay, that's great that we're talking about this, but did you get the previous text? Sometimes all you need is okay, that's funny, that's crazy, something to reaffirm that you are, in fact, listening. Remembering what that person said. This is the one that there's a bit of debate about. There are some people who believe that if you don't remember the communication, it's the equivalent of it not having happened. I personally do not agree with that. I think that even if you don't remember something specifically, it doesn't mean that that connection wasn't there. It doesn't mean that that moment of humanity didn't happen. I know that some of the most important moments in my life were very small to the other person. Moments of kindness, moments of just small things that happened that they probably don't remember at all. But I not only remember, I think that it was really important to my life. So memory is important, but it by no means is the only thing. It by no means means that that communication didn't actually happen. Now, the average person only has about a 33% recall, meaning they only remember about a third of what you hear, see, experience in an average day. Now, I don't know if that seems high or low. Thinking maybe kind of depends on the days. Right now with this quarantine, every day is running into the next. I'm sure none of you remember anything about what's happening. But even on a normal day, I think that I remember the big things, but little details are gone. Like I always say, I hope I never witness a crime because I would not be able to identify anything at all because there's no way I'm paying attention. There's no way I'm going to actually remember it more than 10 minutes later. Part of that, though, is what we call selective focus and selective retention. Selective focus is basically forcing yourself to pay attention to certain things. So think about when you're studying. There's certain things you probably do when you're studying to help you focus, to help you remember. That is then part of your selective retention. Another part of memory deals with something called the primacy effect and the recency effect, which deals with the idea that if you're given a lot of information, are you more likely to remember the beginning of something or the end of something? Now, it really kind of depends on you. It really depends on a number of different factors. But as we go through these, try to think about which one you think you are. The primacy effect, and if you are more, related to the primacy effect, The idea behind that is that you are more likely to remember the first thing you heard or the first thing you experienced. If you're more recency effect based, you're more likely to remember the last thing that you heard or experienced. For example, the experiment that they'll often do about this one is that they will give you a list of 10 to 15 things, words, sailboat, monkey, blow dryer, whatever it is. And then a while later, you're asked to recite what those are, what those words were back to the researcher. If you are more primed in your brain, you will be more likely to remember the first thing. So you can list off the first 3 or 4 things that they told you, but everything else is gone. If you're more recency primed, you're going to be more likely to remember the last 4 or 5 things, but nothing else. The way I like to think about this is I like to think of my brain as a filing cabinet. And if you're more primacy effect, it's that as soon as your filing cabinet of information is full, that's it. You can't learn anything else, you're at full capacity. Where if you're more recency effect, as you're learning more information, your brain is going through all that old useless stuff that it doesn't need anymore, and it's getting rid of it, replacing the old stuff with that new information. I think sometimes it does depend on the situation. It does depend on what kind of thing you're remembering. It depends on how interested you are in that thing, but most people do tend to gravitate more towards one style than the other. So although that list of things that we can do to try to make us better listeners is really easy, it makes sense, it's not always easy to actually do these things. Because there's a lot of stuff that gets in the way. There's a lot of stuff in the world around you. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in your head that could potentially get in the way of you being a good listener, being a good communicator. So let's take a look at a list of some of the situational and internal obstacles that might get in the way of you being an effective listener. Or another way to think about it is external things going on in the world around you that's impacting you, and internal things. What are the things happening inside of your head? So some examples of situational obstacles would be things like incomprehensibility, message complexity, message overload, and environmental distractions. So to go through these one at a time, incomprehensibility is the idea that you don't understand what that person is saying. And there's a lot of reasons why you might not understand somebody. This could be anything from they're mumbling, they're a quiet talker, they're stuttering. If this is like digital technology, they're spelling all of their words wrong. You're getting text messages out of order. Your phone is dropping, every other word in a phone call. This is similar to message complexity because with message complexity, you also are not understanding what is being said. But the difference here is that incomprehensibility, you physically cannot understand them. With message complexity, you can understand them, you just don't understand what they're saying. So this would be things like jargon. This would be things like any sort of technical speak that you just don't understand. This would be me in a math class. I understand the word for, I understand the word multiply, but anything beyond that, I have no idea what you're actually talking about. This is a lot of people doing their taxes. Sometimes this is even you like at the doctor. I recently found out the reason I can't wear contacts is because I have an astigmatism. I apparently have had it for years. It's been in my chart for years, but I never understood what the doctor was telling me because the message for me was just too complex. I understood the individual words, but I didn't understand what they meant. So just like incomprehensibility and message complexity being similar, message overload and environmental distractions are also similar, but with a couple of differences. So to start with environmental distractions, the last one on the list, this is the idea of it's just a distraction. There's not a whole lot else to say about this one. You're trying to watch a movie and the kids behind you are being too loud. You're trying to take a test in school and they're mowing the lawn outside. You're trying to study in the library and somebody's being really loud. Full disclosure, I have now started recording these lectures in my camper in my front lawn. I'm literally in my camper in my front lawn right now because my 3 kids are at home and it's so loud that it was taking forever to edit these because I kept having to stop every time they were being really, really noisy. I couldn't leave all that shouting from my kids in there and all the fighting with each other and all the horsing around and running around playing dress up because that would have been a massive distraction. Every time you're trying to listen to me, you hear my kids screaming in the background. Message overload is slightly different. Message overload is when you are actively trying to listen to multiple messages, but you just can't. Environmental distractions, you're trying to focus on one thing, you're being distracted. Message overload, you're trying to listen to multiple things. If you've ever been watching a TV show and trying to hold down a conversation at the same time, and you just can't do it, that's too many lines of conversation, it's too many lines of thought, all happening simultaneously. Or have you ever been trying to write an essay and watch a TV show at the same time? Or right now, how many of you guys are trying to listen to this while simultaneously watch a movie or a TV show or a YouTube video? Because I guarantee there's at least a handful of you. This is an example of message overload. It's really hard to focus on multiple things, and it's a big thing that gets in the way of you being an effective listener. There's not a ton we're going to say about internal obstacles simply because we've been talking about them pretty much all semester. It's the stuff that happens inside of your head that gets in the way of you being a good listener. You're stressed out. You don't care about what that person is saying. Cultural and social differences is it's just too far apart for you to understand. You can't empathize. You can't understand where they're coming from because culturally what they're talking about or socially where they're coming from is too different from you. You're tired. You're bored. There's any number of things that are happening in this one. Again, we're not going to add anything to this because I don't need to waste your time because we talked about this numerous times already. It's all that stuff that's happening inside of your head. Last thing I want to talk about with listening is what are some of the different ways to be a bad listener. As we go through this list, there's probably at least one or two of these that you have done. Well, I guarantee there's one or two of these that you have all done at some point. But you probably know somebody or at least know a situation where all of these have happened. So as we go through these, try to think about what kind of listener are you? What are some of the times you've done each of these? I'm actually going to send a question relating to this over to the discussion board as well, so you can share your thoughts over there. But some examples of bad listening. First one we have is something called pseudo-listening, which is basically half listening. It's basically your fake listening. The classic example of pseudo-listening is that somebody's talking to you, you're not really paying attention because you're so busy going, yep, but you weren't really listening. Do you guys have any idea how many weddings I've had to go to that I accidentally agreed to because I was watching Game of Thrones when my wife asked me to go to this wedding? That's pseudo-listening. I was watching the story, and then suddenly I end up at the wedding of some person I've never met before because I accidentally said that I would go. That's a classic example of pseudo-listening. Selective listening is something we've talked about. It's when you hear what you want to hear. That one's pretty straightforward. We can take it a step further, though, when talking about defensive listening. That defensive listening is when you go into it basically on the defense. You assume that person is going to pick a fight with you, so you hear it as a fight. You respond as if that person is attacking you when maybe they didn't. You assume something's going to happen, so you go into it and you only hear that thing. Ambushing is a step beyond that. Ambushing is essentially setting somebody up. This would be an example of going into a conversation to try to, trap somebody, to try to get them to say something or to confess to something. This could also be ganging up on a person where multiple people are asking different questions, trying to set a person up. In a lot of ways, this is probably the most aggressive one on this list. You can probably argue it's the most unethical one as well. I think there's maybe a few times where a person might do this with good intentions. For example, let's say somebody needs to talk about something emotionally, but they just can't bring themselves to say it. You might ambush them. You might set them up so that they have to talk about this thing. But for the most part, this is when you're really just setting a person up. Literal listening exists in a couple of different ways. So the first one we can talk about is let's go back to the very first, unit when we were talking about the different layers of meaning, that all communication has different levels, that we have the content level and the relationship level. So the content level is what is the content, what you're saying. The relationship level is how does your relationship alter that. A literal listener is not going to understand the difference between the two and only see the content level. They are literally hearing what you're saying. They're literally receiving your communication, and they're not getting any of the context around it. So this would be something like if a person struggles to understand sarcasm, if this is a person who doesn't understand that people are joking. This is a person who doesn't understand tone. They only understand what is directly being said to them. They are literally listening to the dictionary, the denotative definitions of the language that's being used. And then lastly, we have monopolizing. Monopolizing is basically taking over a conversation. This is an obvious one for being a bad listener because you're basically not listening at all because you're spending the entire time talking yourself. There's a couple of different ways a person will monopolize, though. There is interrupting, and then my personal favorite, conversational rerouting. Interrupting is exactly what it sounds like. It's when a person comes in, they interrupt, and now we're talking about them. They just walk in, they're like, hey guys, so want to hear about my day? Completely disregarding any of the other conversations that was already happening. They just interrupt, and now we're talking about them. What I think is more interesting, though, is conversational rerouting, because people who are good at this will often be able to do it without you even noticing that it happened. So an example of a conversational rerouter would be, let's say that you're talking about your trip to England you're taking this summer and how excited you are. And then your friend who's listening suddenly goes, oh, you're going to England this summer? Well, you remember a few years ago when I went to, and then suddenly we're talking all about their vacation. They've taken one thing that you've said and they managed to spin it around and make it about themselves. Common examples of conversational rerouters would be Debbie Downers. So you know what that is? It's a person where anytime you say something, well, they're going to down it. They're going to be like, well, Miney did this. Well, this. Or a one-upper is another one where anytime you say something, not only have they done that, they've done it bigger, they've done it more, they've done it better. They wait for you to say something, they spin the conversation around, and they make it all about themselves. That's really all I wanted to talk about with listening. It's kind of the main points. And just like everything else, so much of this is just about practicing awareness. Be aware of how you're communicating with people. Be aware of how you're listening. Are you a good listener? Are you not? Try to improve your listening. And again, a big part of that is being mindful, opening yourself up to others, and then actually crossing over the threshold into listening to what they have to say.